we will uncover one of the largest illegal trade operations in human history, started due to Russian, Venezuelan, and Iranian conflicts, and how India has taken out its guns to change the course of this illegal trade in its own favors. And results have come out instantly. As China was cut off from the shadow fleet, it ordered its refiners to stop exports and plead India to strengthen BRICS. While at the same time, India strengthens its partnership with Russia and the USA, such that the USA asks India to refine and sell Russian oil in the global market. This geopolitical story is no less than a Hollywood thriller. Let's start with the shadow fleet or dark fleet. Somewhere in the Indian Ocean, a massive oil tanker shuts its engines. The crew goes quiet and the ship vanishes from every radar screen, every satellite tracker, every monitoring system on Earth. It becomes a ghost. Somewhere between 1400 and 1700 ships are operating in the dark fleet, carrying one-fifth of the global oil for Venezuela, Russia, and Iran. This oil is illegal, evading US sanctions, evading international laws, and until very recently, evading consequences entirely. But something has changed. The United States has started hunting them. And in a move that has stunned geopolitical analysts around the world, India has just joined the hunt. The same India that has been buying Russian oil since 2022. The same India that stood apart from Western sanctions. The same India that looked the West in the eyes when the whole world was watching and when it said, buying Russian oil is in India's national interest. That India just seized Russian tankers in its own waters. But why did India do that? What changed? And what does this mean for Russia's war, for China's economy, and for the biggest geopolitical realignment we have seen in decades? Stay with us because the story goes much deeper than oil. Let's start at the beginning. What exactly is the Dark Fleet? The United States or the United Nations imposes sanctions on oil exports from countries like Venezuela, Iran, and Russia, following a simple idea. Cut off their oil revenue and you cut off their ability to fund their government, their military, their wars. In theory, it works. In practice, meet the Dark Fleet. The Dark Fleet is a network of approximately 1,400 aging tankers, most of them decades old and declared unfit for sailing, operated by anonymous shell companies registered under flags of convenience, and crewed by people who ask no questions. Their entire purpose is to move sanctioned oil across the world without getting caught. They use various tricks to do that. Signal spoofing, going dark, turning off transponders entirely, ship-to-ship transfers. Although ship-to-ship transfers are legal in ports with proper authorization. But in the middle of the ocean, during late night with no oversight, they're a perfect laundering mechanism for sanctioned oil. The fourth trick is the name game. Dark fleet ships cycle through names and flags the way criminals cycle through phones. We have explained these tricks in detail in another video, which you can watch by clicking on the I button. But here comes the law. A flagless ship in international waters has no legal protector. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, a stateless, flagless vessel can be boarded and seized by any national authority. Hundreds of them are sailing right now, lawless, stateless, and suddenly very vulnerable. The scale of the shadow fleet operations will shock you. Approximately 1 in every 5 barrels of oil shipped globally moves through the dark fleet. Venezuela was exporting roughly 8 lakh barrels per day in 2025, about 75% of it on sanctioned tonnage. Russia has been exporting 3 to 4 million barrels per day through dark fleet tankers for 4 consecutive years. Iran adds another significant volume, making the combined dark fleet cargo one of the largest illicit trade operations in human history. These ships have been absolute cash cows for Venezuela's Maduro regime, for Russia's war machine, for Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Billions of dollars flowing invisibly through the world's oceans, funding wars and bypassing the entire international sanctions architecture that took decades to build. But that stops now. In 2026, the United States declared enough was enough. After the capture of Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela's strongman president, The US went after the shadow fleet that had been keeping his regime afloat for years, and it did not politely ask them to stop. Approximately 8 Dark Fleet tankers have been captured by US authorities so far. Well, 8 out of 1400, that sounds small, but that is not the point. When the world's only naval superpower decides to enforce something on the high seas, the question is never of capability, it is of intention. And the US has signaled its intention loudly, clearly, and with warships. The effect on the Dark Fleet was immediate. Insurance companies, who had been quietly covering these vessels, began pulling out. Port operators started refusing entry. Ship captains started calculating risks very differently. And then came the move nobody saw coming. India, the second largest buyer of Russian oil in the world. The country that had been publicly purchasing sanctioned crude since 2022, and when asked about it, shrugged and said it had no idea where the oil came from. That India just started seizing Russian tankers in its own waters. The Wall Street Journal broke the story that the Indian Navy had posted on its Twitter account about the seizure of the Shadow Fleet vessels. But those tweets were deleted quickly, and everybody knows the reason for that. 3 Dark Fleet tankers, almost certainly carrying Russian crude, had been intercepted and captured inside India's exclusive economic zone. 3 ships might seem a small number, but in geopolitics, sometimes 3 ships change everything. Now, this is extraordinary for a number of reasons. Reason 1: India has been a major beneficiary of the Dark Fleet since 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine and Western countries stopped buying Russian oil. India and China stepped in as the primary buyers. India was getting deeply discounted Russian crude, sometimes $20 to $30 below market price. That discount was effectively Russia subsidizing India's energy bill. You might think, wow, what a good friend Russia is. Well, let me tell you, this was not out of goodwill, but this is because of Russian geographical weakness, which is a topic for another video. For India to now go after the ships delivering sanctioned oil is not just a policy shift. It is India walking away from a long-standing tradition by which geopolitical compulsions were narrated by Indian politicians, such that every person in India, from 15-year-olds to 80-year-olds, was made to believe that Russia is a great friend. The second reason is some of the tankers captured carry Russian flags. India has just physically seized Russian government-linked vessels. This is not a diplomatic note. This is not a strongly worded statement. This is the Indian Navy boarding Russian ships. The third reason is India did this inside its own exclusive economic zone, the waters extending 200 nautical miles from its coastline. Under United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, India has full sovereign rights over that zone. But exercising those rights against Russian vessels at this moment is a statement that goes far beyond maritime law. The United States seizing 8 ships is not what breaks the Dark Fleet. What breaks the Dark Fleet is when a second country, especially an unexpected one, joins the operation, because that tells every other country in the world that it is now safe to act. India, a country with close Russian ties, a country that has been buying same oil, steps forward and seizes ships. The effect was almost instant. Belgium, France, the United Kingdom, and a coalition of 14 countries have now joined the operation. Dark Fleet captains who were sailing with confidence are now calculating very different odds. 4 to 5 million barrels per day currently move through Dark Fleet operations. If the coalition holds, that entire volume could be removed from global markets within months. 5 million barrels per day disappearing from global supply does not just affect 1 or 2 countries. It reshapes energy markets, government revenues, battlefield logistics, and the entire balance of Ukraine war all at once. Let's talk about what this means for Russia specifically. Russian oil exports are not a side operation. Oil money is Russia's primary source of foreign income. The money that pays for weapons, for drones, for soldiers' salary, for the entire machinery of the Ukraine war. If the dark fleet is broken, not partially disrupted, but genuinely broken, Russia does not just lose a trade route, it loses the financial engine of its war. We have already seen a preview of what happens when Russia loses key resources. In February 2026, when Elon Musk's Starlink blocked Russian military access to its satellite networks, Russian forces on the front line lost communication coherence almost immediately. Results were visible on the battlefield immediately. Russia lost net territory on the Ukrainian front line following the Starlink disruption. It can be seen as a preview of what supply chain collapse looks like on the battlefield. That was communications. Now imagine what happens when the money stops. Russia is heavily dependent on China for military equipment, chips, drones, and components that keep the war machine running. But China does not give this equipment for free. Russia pays for it. And Russia pays for it with oil money. Remove the oil money, and Russia cannot pay China. China stops supplying, and the Russian military starts running short of the very equipment that has kept it fighting. Russia's oil revenues account for roughly 30 to 40% of its total federal budget. The dark fleet operations carry the majority of Russia's export volume, as the legal routes have been largely closed by Western sanctions. And there is a deeper geopolitical dimension here that most analysts are missing. Russia has become so deeply dependent on China that it is functionally Beijing's junior partner. Russia has been supplying fighter jet engines to Pakistan for JF-17 jets that are specifically designed and used against India. Russia has delayed India's S-400 missile defense system deliveries. For India, Russia is not an ally anymore. It is becoming liability in Soviet clothing. Hence, India seizing Russian ships is not just about oil. It is India sending Russia a message that the old relationship needs new terms and conditions, and those terms are being renegotiated in the Indian Ocean. Since the fall of Soviet Union, the decline of Russia and exponential rise of USA is reality, which India has accepted, which became more apparent in 2026. In January 2026, Donald Trump and Narendra Modi had discussions over phone. After that, Trump announced something remarkable, that the United States is going to cut its tariffs on Indian goods by more than half. For Indian exporters, this is potentially worth billions of dollars. But what did India agree to do in return? In the official statement, nothing. Not a single Indian government official mentioned Russian oil. Not one word about dark fleet tankers. Indian diplomacy stayed perfectly silent on the subject. But action speaks louder than the press releases. Within weeks of that meeting, the Indian Navy was in the water hunting dark fleet tankers. The deal was real. It was just never said out loud. But let me share our personal analysis. We do not believe India's actions represent a permanent, irreversible strategic shift. We believe India seized those 3 ships primarily as a calculated action in coordination with the United States. A goodwill gesture to help Trump sell the tariff deal to the American public. A message that says, look, India is with the US. Give them the trade benefits, and at the same time show that if India feels Russia is moving too closer to China, then it will and it can act. Earlier, India warned Russia by words. Long back, India delivered its message loud and clear that India is not happy with Russian war. Modi delivered a message to Putin, delivered face to face, that this is not the era of war. This is not a polite diplomatic nicety. Now combine that message with the seizure of tankers and Indo-US trade. It's clear that India telling Russia that the Cold War era affiliation is over, that India will not risk its economic future, its relationship with the United States, and its strategic position in Asia to fund a war where Russia is becoming China's junior partner. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, India is clearly turning its back on Russia and moving towards the West, right? Wrong. And what happens next is the part of the story that almost nobody is talking about. I need you to hold 2 things in your head at the same time. The Indian Navy is seizing Russian tankers, and at the exact same time, the US government is telling India to buy more Russian oil. Both of these things are happening simultaneously, and they are not a contradiction. They are the same strategy. In a recent press briefing, the United States Energy Secretary made a statement that almost nobody in the mainstream media properly unpacked. Let me tell you exactly what he said. He said, buy the Russian oil, bring it into your refineries, and sell it in the global markets to keep the crude prices under control in the wake of the Iran war. Although he tried to make various excuses for allowing India to buy oil, but in geopolitics, nobody says anything clearly. The United States, the same government that is hunting dark fleet tankers, is actively telling India to buy Russian oil. Not dark fleet oil, but legitimate Russian oil. It indicates that the US is not trying to starve Russia of oil income. It is trying to redirect Russian oil away from China towards India, such that on one hand it keeps global prices stable and simultaneously cuts China's energy discount. And here is the part that makes your head spin. Russia is cooperating, which clearly shows that Russia is also becoming uncomfortable with its over-dependence on China and looking for space to maneuver. Look at what Bloomberg's live ship tracking data confirmed this week. Two Russian oil cargoes that had been signaling East Asia, which obviously means China, as their destination suddenly changed course. According to live ship tracking data, they switched destination to India. Russia's own tankers, heading for China, turned around and went to India instead. Now ask yourself the single most important question in this entire story. Why is Russia allowing its oil to go where the US wants it to go? Nobody is forcing them, as USA has still now acted with caution in capturing Russian shadow fleet vessels. Russia is voluntarily diverting its own ships away from China and towards India. Why would Russia do that? The answer is that there is a Russia-US deal forming underneath all of this. Russia wants a peace deal in Ukraine. The US is the only party that can deliver one. The current war in the Middle East was never really about Iran versus the USA. At its deepest level, it is about the US versus China. And Russia has just signaled that it understands this and is ready to switch sides as per its national interest. India is not choosing West over Russia. India is becoming the bridge, the trusted party that both the US and Russia can work through. Let's quickly summarize the picture. India is buying Russian oil with America's blessing and at the same time seizing Russian dark fleet ships, while at the same time getting a tariff deal from Trump, and Russia is cooperating with all of it. This is not India betraying Russia. This is India, Russia, and the US all moving in the same direction, with China as the common target. This is the new axis nobody is announcing. Soon after the US and Israel destroy the Iranian regime and a peace deal is reached between Russia and Ukraine, you will find India, Russia, US, Israel, and Iran on the same side. The real axis forming is not East versus West. It is India becoming the chief negotiator to bring everyone together against China's growing dominance. Every single piece of this puzzle points at the same direction. The target is not Russia, Iran, or Venezuela's oil income. The target is China's access to cheap energy. And India has become the instrument of that strategy willingly, profitably, and with complete deniability. Let's zoom out one final level, because when you lay all the pieces side by side, the Indian Navy seizures, the US Energy Secretary statement, the Bloomberg's ship tracking data, Russia voluntarily redirecting tankers from China to India, only one conclusion makes sense. The dark fleet crackdown was never primarily about Venezuela. It was never primarily about punishing Russia. It was about cutting off China's access to cheap, sanctioned energy. And it is working, as China has already ordered its refineries to not export any oil. Think about what it looks like in China. Since 2022, China built its entire energy import strategy around one assumption, that it could buy discounted Russian, Venezuelan, and Iranian crude indefinitely through dark fleet channels, while the world looked the other way. For Venezuelan oil, China even built a $10 billion refinery named the Guangdong Petrochemical Complex in Guangdong province. And then came 2026, when the world stopped looking the other way. Look at the sequence of events. Maduro arrested in January, Iran removed from the map in February, Russian oil diverted in March. That assumption of China boosting its economy on cheap oil is now being dismantled, piece by piece. China is being squeezed in the most sophisticated way possible. No bombs, no invasions, no dramatic announcements. Just ships quietly changing course in the Indian Ocean. If India stays the course, if it keeps buying legal Russian oil with US approval, keeps seizing dark fleet ships, and keeps this three-way arrangement going, then we are watching the most sophisticated geopolitical maneuver India has ever executed. Not India choosing the West, not India abandoning Russia. India is making moves that benefits everyone except China. The dark fleet may or may not survive. Some ships will find new routes, new flags, new tricks. The shadow economy never dies cleanly, but a very loud message is being sent silently. India has chosen quietly, profitably, serving its own interests while helping both Washington and Moscow reach an arrangement they both need. That is not a betrayal of Russia. That is not a submission to America. That is India working according to the national interest. If this video gave you something to think about, share it, subscribe, and we will see you for the next video. Namaste.